in 2006 as a result of the tsunami of 2004. And so that was a group that was set up as a first responder in the case of a disaster. And then since COVID-19 is also a disaster, it is natural for the Quad to seek to work together. Its mandate covers such issues, and its expansion to Quad Plus is something on which we will reflect. To cover a few other points like the recent participation of HMAS Parramatta in the South China Sea in FONOPS conducted by the US in the wake of the Chinese announcement, the creation of 2 new districts to govern the the Spratlys and the Paracels. They have come out with 18 new geographical names for places there. Recently, the Chinese have also conducted drills against Taiwan. There too, the Americans have come in with their own ships. Ramming of a Vietnamese boat by the Chinese. So there is all this and more that you might like to reflect on. The key point is, how do you see the Indo-Pacific today at a time when the entire world is preoccupied with the COVID-19 issue? The Chinese seem to be doing what they have planned to do, which is to expand their presence in the South China Sea, in the Indo-Pacific. How do you see our cooperation going forward? Do you feel there will be some impact on the operational presence of some of the navies, including in the conduct of FONOPS in the South China Sea, or presence and activities of big powers in the Indian Ocean as a result of what happened, for instance, on the Theodore Roosevelt aircraft carrier, that is to say, the outbreak of the pandemic? So please try to cover all this. Please give us some take on how things are going internally in Australia. Recently, I read about the Wagga Wagga Council, that incidentally means the place where all the crows congregate to meet. That's the Aboriginal meaning of Wagga Wagga. Wagga Wagga, by the way, produced famous cricketer Jeff Lawson, fast bowler, who for a while coached the Indian team as well. But Wagga Wagga, I'm told, has recently decided to break its sister city relations with Kunming, eliciting a very strong response. I've introduced you at length and introduced the topic at length. So from now on, the floor is yours. Dr. David Brewster, all the way from Australia, virtually, of course. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And look, you've sort of given me quite a long agenda there, sir, to cover, and I'll endeavour to do so. First of all, I'd just like to say that here in Australia, those of us who do a lot of work in India, our thoughts are definitely with all of our Indian friends and colleagues in regarding the COVID crisis, and we certainly keep a very close watch on developments in India, and certainly all of us here hope that things will turn out for the best. My personal view is that India is fairly well placed, a lot better placed than many other countries in with this, and I certainly hope that it's going to turn out reasonably well. So today I'm going to talk about the Indo-Pacific region as a concept and some aspects of how it will work as a strategic system. And I'll talk about different perspectives of geographic boundaries in the Indo-Pacific and really whether those differences actually matter. And I'll also talk about what the Indo-Pacific is not, because I think it's just as important to understand what it is not as what it is. And look, there are many definitions being proposed for the Indo-Pacific, and I'm not really going to go through them in great detail today. Suffice it to say that the Indo-Pacific is an idea of a region, at least for some particular purposes, that includes the Eurasian littoral, associated ocean areas, and potentially also other parts of the Indian Pacific Oceans. And my conclusion that I'm going to argue today is that the concept of the Indo-Pacific is extremely valuable for some purposes, but we have to be cautious and restrain ourselves from trying to overly define the idea. The Indo-Pacific is going to naturally mean different things to different people and countries due to whether it's history, geography, other factors. And we really need to accept those differences and not get too worried about trying to force everyone to have the same idea of the Indo-Pacific. So the starting point in understanding the Indo-Pacific is that historically, at least during the modern era, the Pacific and Indian Oceans were seen as largely separate strategic spheres. And certainly in Australia and many other countries, they occupied quite different mental maps of the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, and they really were rarely put together. The East Asia and the Pacific were seen as operating with one particular set of economic, political, and security dynamics, and Southern Asia and the Indian Ocean with a different set of dynamics, and interactions between the two theatres were seen as relatively limited. Now, for Australia, the idea of the Asia-Pacific region reflected that idea of the Pacific and East Asia operating within its own dynamics. And indeed, Australia was really one of the foremost promoters of the idea of the Asia-Pacific in the 1970s and 1980s. And really from the Australian perspective, the Asia-Pacific region had the benefit, it was seen as binding the United States economically and strategically into East Asia and promoting stability and trade liberalisation after the end of the Vietnam War. So those were seen as the really the imperatives for Australia in promoting the idea of the Asia-Pacific back in the 70s and 80s. And indeed, this concept of the Asia-Pacific was really quite a successful one. And it became virtually ubiquitous, certainly in Australia and a lot of other countries, in the way they defined their region. You asked, if you go back 10 years or so ago, if you asked an Australian, what region was Australia in? They almost certainly would say, we are in the Asia-Pacific. But nevertheless, the Asia-Pacific was a bit of a strange beast. It was, because it sort of encompassed most of the Pacific, it included North America, some countries in South America, and East Asia and Australia, but it really excluded India and a lot of other countries in South Asia or West Asia, for example. And indeed, the Indian Ocean, as I mentioned, was seen as operating in quite a different sphere from the Pacific. And that reflected the fact that the Indian Ocean region was less politically organised, and it was dominated by different powers compared with the Pacific. But as we know, this perceived separation of the two is now changing, led by the expansion of countries like China and Japan into the Indian Ocean. Sorry, could someone mute there? Yeah. Okay, sorry, I was getting some feedback.
Yeah, Piyush, please make sure that everybody's mics are on mute. It's going to be your responsibility. Kindly see that, please.
Sure, sir.
Yeah. And also the expansion of India's interests into the Pacific. So we're increasingly seeing that we can't really understand developments that are occurring in the Pacific Ocean without also understanding the Indian Ocean and vice versa. So now, different perceptions of the Indo-Pacific seem to occupy quite a lot of the time of a lot of people. And in my view, a lot of these concerns expressed by various analysts are a little bit unnecessary and not necessarily helpful. And my key point here is that countries will naturally have different perceptions of what constitutes the the Indo-Pacific, and that's a normal thing and not something that we should really get too fussed about. Now, from Australia's perspective, Australia was really a very early adopter of the Indo-Pacific, and I think it was actually probably the first country in the world to adopt it in official policy as its concept of its region, and that was adopted in the 2013 Defence White Paper, and now it's quite broadly adopted by the Australian government and increasingly also the Australian public. And so if you ask someone in Australia now what region they considered Australia to be in, very likely they would say the Indo-Pacific, whereas 10 years ago they might have said the Asia-Pacific. So that's really an indication of how broadly the idea and quickly the idea has become adopted here. So importantly, Australia sees it as a flexible and evolving concept, and that includes its geographic reach. Obviously, as I mentioned, Australia's perspectives are going to be different from other countries for very good reasons. And so, for example, Australia places a lot more emphasis on, for example, on the Pacific Islands, Pacific Island states than others. Australia's official concept of the Indo-Pacific in the Indian Ocean piece is great emphasis to the Eastern Indian Ocean and ending more or less on India's western borders. And again, that is for good reason, and that more restricted definition of the Indo-Pacific was adopted for quite practical reasons, and that was to try and refocus defence resources away from the Middle East into the Eastern Indian Ocean. So refocus it back closer to home in response to threats presented by China rather than threats that existed in the Middle East. Now, that's debatable, and personally, I would like to see greater allocation of resources by Australia in the Western Indian Ocean, not necessarily defence resources, I should hasten to add, more diplomatic resources in conjunction with partners such as India. Indonesia, I'll just add in that has also been thinking about similar concepts under a different name, such as it's used the idea of the global maritime fulcrum, and ASEAN also has adopted its own Indo-Pacific strategy in which they inevitably see ASEAN as a central institution in the Indo-Pacific, and that's fine and understandable for them. I think others might potentially disagree with that, but that's completely understandable. So from Australia's standpoint, we've seen India being quite cautious about the Indo-Pacific concept. And certainly I saw a lot of debate in Delhi for some time about what it actually meant for India. I think there was a number of misperceptions about that it was somehow promoted by the United States, which I thought was quite interesting and odd to some degree. And also, but also I thought that, I mean, from my perspective, I understood the reasoning of many analysts who argue that India should focus on the Indian Ocean rather than more extensive view. I didn't agree with that view, but I understand the thinking behind it. But nevertheless, we've seen India, I think probably maybe over the last 4 or 5 years or so, adopting the Indo-Pacific idea. Although inevitably, India places a fair degree of emphasis on the Western Indian Ocean, much more than Australia, and that again is for obvious and understandable reasons that India would see greater importance in the areas that are close to it in the Western Indian Ocean and Africa. And that's entirely understandable from my perspective. just, interestingly, the big extra regional powers, the United States and China, have actually had very little involvement in the development of the Indo-Pacific concept. And certainly the United States was a very late adopter of it, of the idea. When I would remark for quite a long time in my visits to the United States that there was really very little understanding of the concept of the Indo-Pacific there. And ultimately, when the United States really sort of started adopting the Indo-Pacific, say around 2 or 3 years ago, they basically borrowed most of the concepts from the Japanese more than anyone. But it certainly wasn't a concept that was developed in the United States, or really they even participated in the thinking. Could I ask someone to turn off their mic again, please?
Has anybody got their mics on, please? And Piyush, have you omitted to mute somebody's mic?
Yes, sir. I muted the mic, sir. If you join me,
No, is there anybody's mic which is on? Because we can't afford to have static coming in.
Yes, sir. No, it's muted, sir. Everybody is muted.
Then how do we get the static? Anyway, I'm sorry, Dr. Brewster.
I think General Dipankar Banerjee's mic is on because this thing comes up whenever there is a disturbance.
So Piyush, can you mute that, please?
Yes, sir.
Is that on?
No, sir.
Right now, is it on? Was it on?
Yes, sir. He joined the meeting in between, sir. So his mic was on. Now it's
yeah. So just keep a hawk eye on the new, the people who are joining in. So,
yes.
Right. Thank
yes,
you.
Sir.
I'm sorry, Dr. Brewster. This is a learning curve for a lot of us. We've not lived in an age where everything is conducted virtually like this.
Yeah.
So we're still holding our skills,
We're all on a very steep learning curve recently.
Yes. Pardon us for that. Please.
Yeah. So China also, interestingly, has avoided adopting the term Indo-Pacific, and really there's the indications were that they sort of somehow saw it as some sort of US plot, which it really wasn't. But indeed, that hasn't stopped China having its own Indo-Pacific policy, and really what else is the Belt and Road Initiative but the Indo-Pacific with Chinese characteristics? And that certainly shows, and that's really a good lesson not to get hung up with terminology. It's about the substance. China has its own Indo-Pacific policy, even though it rejects the term. Importantly, we also have to make a very clear distinction in our own minds about our idea of the Indo-Pacific as a region, and the strategies that we may adopt towards the region. So you can say, for example, I'm just picking an example, Europe is a region, fine, but then countries might adopt a particular strategy towards you engaging with Europe. They're very different things, region and a strategy. And so different countries have adopted or are adopting different strategies towards the Indo-Pacific region. But there are some differences, but also a lot of similarities. And certainly many of the larger current countries are coalescing around these ideas of key values or norms which should be adopted towards the region: support for a rule-based order, economic integration and inclusiveness. So there are sort of coalescence about the strategies, but not necessarily the same, and that's fine. So I'll just spend a couple of minutes saying what the Indo-Pacific is not. The Indo-Pacific is not the aggregation of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean as some sort of mega region. That would be foolish. Almost meaningless to say, well, Chile or Peru is in the same region as Madagascar. It doesn't mean anything. It's entirely unwieldy. It's a functional concept, and I'll come back to what that means. It also doesn't involve absolutely clear and defined lines on a map. So we're not talking about pulling out a map and drawing a very hard line about a particular area, saying this is the Indo-Pacific and everything else is outside it. We need a degree of fuzziness to, we need to be careful not to just simply arbitrarily exclude some countries on the basis of the map. We have to, and I understand people have a natural urge to draw bright lines on maps, but we have to try and avoid that as much as possible, understanding that different countries will have different views about what's in and what's not. And as I mentioned, countries will have different focuses, whether they be economic, political, or security. And again, we need to be sensitive to that and not try and jam every country into the same model. There's not going to be any overarching organization or club of countries in the Indo-Pacific similar to what we saw with the Asia-Pacific and APEC. So in my view, the Indo-Pacific is simply too big and too diverse for that. And rather what we're seeing is the development of a web of arrangements and organizations between different countries across the region. And this includes the so-called minilateral coalitions, such as the quadrilateral and various other trilateral arrangements. And you know, we should resist the urge to develop some sort of mega club because, again, it's just too big, too many members to be functional. So, in short, I would argue that there's no definitive list of Indo-Pacific countries. There's no formal club to join or not join. There's no piece of paper to sign or not sign. And that's absolutely fine in my view. I mentioned before that we have to make a very clear distinction between our thinking about the Indo-Pacific as a region and the strategies that countries may adopt towards that region. And so, for example, we've seen Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which I think many important elements have been adopted by the United States. We've seen countries such as Australia and India and Japan and the United States pursuing this quadrilateral arrangement, which is it's in itself a form of Indo-Pacific strategy, and various other trilateral arrangements. And in thinking about this, we have to understand the Indo-Pacific really as primarily as a functional rather than as a geographic concept. So it's not just saying, well, this is a slice of the map that is the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific really, it provides a valuable framework for responding to changes in our strategic environment, involving interactions between East Asia and Indian Ocean. And in particular, the key focus of the Indo-Pacific, in my view, is really the interaction between major powers, principally in the maritime context. Now, we have to understand that even where we find the Indo-Pacific concept useful, it doesn't exclude the fact that we will use the Indian Ocean region, for example, as a concept of a region for other purposes, or the Pacific as a concept of a region for other purposes. It's a little bit complex, but for example, if we were looking at, I'm just going to pick an example, piracy or illegal fishing, it makes much more sense for countries like India and Australia to look at the Indian Ocean region as a sort of a block just for our own mental purposes in responding to that, rather than trying to look at the whole Indo-Pacific. So my key point there is that Indo-Pacific is a functional concept, and it's for particular purposes, and it doesn't necessarily exclude using other concepts, different concepts of regions. Now, the COVID crisis, and I'm going to respond to some of the points that you've made. The COVID crisis, obviously, we need to see this yet play out, but as far as we can see at the moment, it seems to likely involve an acceleration of the rivalries and the changes that we were seeing over the last several years. In my view, it will more likely than not lead to China becoming more assertive rather than less assertive, and indeed to the extent that there is internal instability in China or economic problems in China, there will be temptations for China's leadership to undertake more assertive actions externally to play the nationalist card, and we could possibly put some of the actions vis-a-vis Taiwan in that sort of category. And, you know, at the same time, it makes sense for China to be more assertive, to take what it can at the moment with the United States being so internally distracted. And that's going to continue through the US election season this year. And certainly, you know, China may well find opportunities to gain ground while the United States is distracted. At the same time, we've also seen indications that China's lack of transparency in dealing with the COVID crisis is uniting a lot of other countries in their criticism of China. And so we've certainly seen that in Europe, where a lot of European countries are arguing that it's sort of bringing to a head a lot of their concerns about China. And also, I think we're seeing to a somewhat lesser extent similar developments in our own region. I'll make some comments now about Australia's perspectives on China. I think our foreign policy white paper in 2017.
Yes, 2017.
Sorry, my brain was saying
No,
2017.
no, you got it right.
Yeah. I think the white paper was very clear from Australia's perspective in emphasising the Australia's reliance on a rule-based order in the region and the threat presented by China. No shadow of a doubt where the threat was coming from in terms of the rule-based order. I think, sir, in looking at the press, which obviously you do follow about Australia, you have to be quite careful in understanding the significance of things. In fact, China really has relatively low level of influence in this country, and the efforts that it has made to gain influence, which have been there, have often been very ham-handed and quite unsuccessful, and also frequently very much directed at the local Chinese community rather than the broader community. Their principal objective, in my view, has been to control the discourse within the local Chinese community, and particularly within the large Chinese student population in Australia. So what they did not want to happen was Chinese students coming to be educated in Australia and returning with questionable ideas about democracy, etc. So a lot of effort by China in controlling the discourse within the Chinese and Chinese student community. Efforts really to affect the Australian political system have been actually really not terribly successful from their standpoint, and indeed their ham-handedness has really provoked a major backlash, which has led Australia, I think, probably is now one of the leading countries in the world, in my view, in terms of being very careful in making sure that China, making it a lot more difficult for China to exert much influence here. And indeed, Australia, I think, was the first country in the world to exclude Huawei from its participation in our communications system. And that's been followed, as you know, by certainly the other United States and New Zealand, Canada, and now I've seen the UK is even following that just in recent times. You rightly mentioned the focus Australia has given probably over the last 2 years or so to concerns about growing Chinese influence among the Pacific Island states. They're very vulnerable, they're relatively weak, and we're open to Chinese influence. Again, we have to be careful not to overstate it. Australian aid to those countries far outweighs any money that China is spending there. And yes, there has been a significant increase in Chinese aid, but it's not even comparable lengths, the amount of aid and the amount of economic influence exerted between China and Australia. But nevertheless, that being said, Australia is right to place a lot of emphasis on ensuring that our Pacific Island friends are not subject to undue influence. They have relatively weak political systems and can be subject to undue influence. So I think we're right to be focusing on that. FONOPS, Australia does not conduct FONOPS, let me be clear. Australia does not conduct FONOPS, and it never has, and has no intention to. At the same time, Australia has had a military presence in the South China Sea since the 1940s, and a continual military presence in the South China Sea since around 1980. So it's nothing new at all for Australian aircraft and ships to be present there, obviously in coordination with the United States, but Australia doesn't conduct FONOPS as such, even if the press may report them in that way. Australian vessels travel wherever they wish to in accordance with international law. You asked for some comments about the Quad Plus meeting. I can see it makes a lot of sense to, at least in the long term, to expand the Quad to include other like-minded countries. I would be relatively cautious about the timing of that, because you don't want to sort of, I think, expand it too quickly without really developing substance. So I suppose it's a matter of judgment about how quickly you expand it, while also trying to maintain substance to it. But I can say that I think the COVID crisis and really US paralysis in the face of that crisis calls for countries like India and Australia and Japan, and I would also add France into that list, to get together and step up as in supporting a global response to COVID. Frankly, in my view, I think the United States is just not capable of showing that sort of leadership at the moment. It may change, but I don't think they're capable at the moment, and that calls for countries such as ours to group together and show that leadership and support international institutions and a global response. And I think there's been calls, for I've seen calls for Japan and Australia and India to do that, and I would add France to that list as well, because I think we need an important European partner in that sort of enterprise. You also mentioned about the impact of COVID on navies. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're very, very lucky in Australia that we're almost on the point of zero COVID in new infections. There was 7 yesterday across the whole of the country, which is an extraordinarily good, lucky sign. I'm not aware of any Australian naval vessels having been afflicted yet. Obviously, our Navy is very, very aware of the problems faced by other navies and the way that it can basically make naval vessels out of action. And so certainly I think Australian naval vessels are spending a lot more time at sea than they might have previously. They have to be have the ability to support Australia's COVID response in the country, but also in the Pacific Islands. And I wrote a piece recently about the potential for that. My concern in the Pacific Islands, for example, is that if COVID hits Pacific Islands in a big way, which I think it will, in a much more severe way than in Australia, those countries have very fragile infrastructure, power, and communications could go down quite easily in the face of a large-scale COVID outbreak, and Australia needs to be prepared, including through the use of defence forces, to step in and assist those countries to keep key infrastructures operating, and the Navy, I think, would have an important role in that. One only other point is Chinese investments. When COVID first struck, I think this was about a month or so ago, Australia put severe limitations in any foreign investments into Australian companies, and that was really because of the stock exchange crash. It made Australian companies much cheaper, than they ought to be, and frankly, it was actually not really specifically directed at China, because the level of Chinese investment in Australia is relatively low. I think it's the 5th largest investor. We have much larger investors from Europe and the United States, for example. And I think there would be concerns if any foreigners came in and bought up assets or companies on the cheap. So, I assume that restriction will stay for quite some time until at least some of the worst effects of COVID have passed. I think I've tried to cover all of the points you raised there, so
Indeed,
I'll just
you
leave
have.
it Q&A.
Indeed, you have. Absolutely. And thank you very much for giving us a very broad overview and all-encompassing bird's eye view of the Indo-Pacific, stretching from, shall I say, Sydney to Somalia in that broadest sense. The only thing that struck me was your mention of India being cautious, and also the fact that you did feel that US and China are extra-regional powers. I thought that was truer of China in the Indian Ocean, and certainly not of the US in both the oceans. But we leave that for you to respond.
I'm sorry, I did misspeak there.
No worries, no worries.
Yeah.
You can respond to it. Now, I'll move quickly to questions because we have many people eagerly waiting to ask questions. So I will now begin with the first in that order. Yes, the first one is Admiral Sinha, who has both a comment and a question. Piyush, please unmute Admiral Sinha's mic.
Can you hear me, Sujan?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh.
Go ahead, Sinha.
Thank you, and thank you, David. It's really, I couldn't have asked for anything better than this. And I'm also happy that you mentioned about the concern of India in the Western Indian Ocean, which doesn't normally get covered by the Indo-Pacific. We have raised this point number of times, but very superficial changes have been done as far as the US is concerned. And as you know, that most of the terrorism is, on the littorals of the Western Indian Ocean, and often they spill onto the maritime domain. Having said that, let me just, get you to the 2-3 questions or maybe a point that I have. The Australia is quite intertwined with the Chinese as far as, mining and other industries are concerned. And you have a lot of stake because you have a trade advantage against China, and China is in negative. I think of all your trades, at 26 or 27%, you have the trade surplus. How does Australia intend, bringing it down so that the undue economic influence is not applied by China when the push comes to shove? That is number one. The second point, I have always wondered why it took Australia such a long time to join the Quad, and do you see a possibility. And I'm very happy that you mentioned that, COVID provides an opportunity for these countries to come together for an international response. And I think that's a good way to start. Do you see it actually becoming a sort of congregation of countries of like-minded people who can actually take on the lawbreakers, not the pirates and not the sort of small-time stream, but let's say a country like China, which is breaking law very often at sea, the UNCLOS is not being sort of respected. Do you see that any provision like that can emerge as per our future of the Quad's charter? So these are the 2 points I have really. But it was really very well spoken talk, David. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Thank you. I will move. I would suggest you take a few questions that are about 3, so you can lump them together. So therefore, the next one is General Dua. Piyush, please help General Dua.
Yes, sir, General Dua, sir. You are unmuted.
First of all, thank you very much for a very, very, very good exposure to your views on on the topic. Really happy to have been here. My question is on the fact that you mentioned that while a lot of cooperation is taking place amongst the states here, but your view was that Indo-Pacific is a functional concept. It does not have an organization like EPEC, and it does not perhaps need an organization like EPEC. We can cooperate. There can be several smaller engagements within this broad framework, all the countries that form part of it. I have a slightly different point of view, and I'd like your comment on that. If you look at South China Sea, it used to be a problem between the 6 countries. China was dominating them. The world really did not have any time for South China Sea. Somewhere when we stuck some oil or there was potential of oil and other things happened, then that's the time when this thing came to fore. And then world started also taking interest in South China Sea. I've seen this. I used to work in Vietnam for a few years. Coming to the point, what has happened is that thereafter, now as we know, China is asserting itself not only in the South China Sea, the entire area we're talking about, we've spoken about it. What Dr. Sujan pointed out very correctly, that Quad started after tsunami as a relief measure. As one of the things was relief, and thereafter now it's only correct that after the COVID crisis there is a Quad plus happening and things like that. My point is, the question is, if we continue to let it be a sort of a hazy concept, fuzziness is the word you use, then when there is a crisis or a requirement, unless you have the strength of a small, it not be a very pretentious headquarter, but a small secretariat or a coordinating authority who sends out the message to everybody, eventually participation or lack of it will be individual choice of every country. But the fact that rather than waiting for a particular leader to start taking charge and then start acting on it, the strength comes from the fact that there is a nucleus who's duty bound to start taking interest, and then we see a participation as that pulls in. I only hope I've expressed myself well. I would use on that.
Thank you. Thank you for that question and comment. Do we have, may I have your sort of indulgence to convey one more question to you, and then you can take all of it together. We have Commodore Abhay Singh from the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, and his question is essentially this: that normally when you have pandemics and other cataclysmic events, you expect the global community to start focusing on issues of peace and development and relief, and actors are expected to divert their energies to medical research rather than geopolitical contestation. But his feeling is, and he wants your comment on this, is that this hypothesis does not seem to be valid in the Indo-Pacific region in the current context when the COVID-19 is raging. So these are the few questions, and maybe you can address all these together. The floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. All really good questions. Look, Australia's trade relationship with China is a difficult and interesting question. First, I should say that Australia makes vast amounts of money out of trade with China. The investment relationship is a lot more constrained. And while China's investments in Australia is growing, it's growing from basically a zero base, and it still remains a relatively small investor in Australia. So that is a good indication of the type of influence or non-influence in economic terms. Significant influence, or there's a significant trade relationship, but a much smaller investment relationship. Now, Australia makes very significant amounts of money out of selling resources to China, and in particularly energy. Many of you might know, but Australia is the largest exporter of natural gas, liquefied natural gas in the world, and much of those energy and is sold to China and others in East Asia. Now, we have to be, the balance of power within that relationship is often mistaken, and indeed Australia actually has a lot more influence over China than many people understand, in terms of being a key supplier of the things that China needs. And China cannot easily replace many of those supply relationships. And so it's the balance of power between the two countries is actually a lot more complicated than many people understand. That being said, there's very much an awareness, and that's probably even more heightened during the COVID crisis, that Australia needs to diversify its trade relationships, and also in some key areas give a greater focus to economic sovereignty in terms of production of and I think a great example of that is oil refining. We're basically allowed most oil refining to move overseas. We need that capability in Australia. So it's diversification from China to other countries, such as India is a great example, but also a greater focus on economic sovereignty where that's necessary. In terms of the quadrilateral, I think we're all in agreement that the COVID crisis is an opportunity to give greater weight to the quadrilateral, and I think you could probably make an analogy that the 2004 tsunami led to the first iteration of the quadrilateral, which unfortunately didn't proceed. But this crisis, I think we should all try and seize the opportunity to strengthen the quadrilateral. As I mentioned earlier on, I'm just a little bit cautious about making it too broad before you deepen the relationship, and that's always a difficult judgment to make, whether you deepen relationships or you broaden them. And I don't know whether including you can name a number of potential additional partners. I would certainly put France at the top of that list, because I think they're an important European country. They're also an important country within our Indo-Pacific region, whether it be in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific. So I think I see them as a very important partner. In relation to the question about what structures we try and develop to cope with or to reflect the Indo-Pacific, when I said fuzzy, I meant fuzzy in terms of the geographic definition of the region, not fuzzy in terms of structures. I strongly believe that I don't think a structure which includes all of the countries in the region is just tenable. It's just too many countries. They have too many different interests. And the great majority of those countries basically have no capabilities to contribute. And so I think the idea that countries, like-minded countries like India and Japan and Australia and a small number of others really have to take the lead, because we are the countries with the capabilities, we are the countries with the willingness to act. And with the United States distracted, it's much more incumbent on countries such as us to act, whether it be to act in terms of responding to Chinese assertiveness, which we should expect, or acting in terms of supporting international structures. And, you know, I would regard the second as just as important as the first. It's not just about responding to specific Chinese assertiveness, it's about maintaining these all-important international structures in the face of the crisis. And unfortunately, we see both not only China trying to attack those structures, but also a number of leaders in the United States attacking those structures. And that just means that it's much more important that countries such as ours continue to support those structures. I think it's a very interesting comment about pandemics, and that in some cases they will lead to a greater focus on cooperation and medical response to those pandemics. I think that that's not going to be the case here, and obviously China's role, or the fact that the virus originated in China in somewhat obscure circumstances, I think has led many countries to rightfully question the level of transparency that China is willing to offer and their value as an international partner. And so I only see, unfortunately, this leading to greater geopolitical contestation, particularly if China becomes more assertive in response to all of these events rather than less assertive. And I think I take a rather pessimistic view that we are going to see a weaker economy, instability in China, and a nationalistic response by China's leadership, which would include being more assertive, not only in the South China Sea, but also fairly likely in South Asia as well, which would obviously be of great concern to India. So I think that's what we need to expect. We need to prepare for it, and we need countries like India and Japan and Australia need to be working together and ready to act together in response to those developments.
Thank you. In a way, I think the convergence that today exists between the four countries in the putative Quad is that everybody seems to agree that it should be open, it should be transparent, there should be rules of the road. And everybody seems to agree in terms of the statements that came out after the ministerial meeting in September in New York, that it should be inclusive. Now, there is a slight hint of a contradiction between trying to make it more inclusive, which means willy-nilly that you have to broad base your dialogue, you've got to give people the feeling that they are part of that conversation on the Indo-Pacific, and what you said, which is that you'd rather deepen it first before broadening it. So I kind of sensed a hint of some kind of a crossroad there, a little bit of a point that needs elaboration. I have two more comments, stroke questions here. Commodore Robbie Thomas is a serving naval officer with our institute. His point is that it's quite likely that Australia will be included in the next edition of the Malabar. I mean, that's his presumption or kind of anticipation. In 2021, it could be as early as 2021. And would that presumably militarize the Quad? As in, does that really make it more military? I personally think no, because if it's to be taken as a military concept, 3 is good enough too, to give it that slant, So Australia coming on board does not necessarily make it more military or less military in terms of what the Malabar is currently doing. But anyway, people are here to have your thoughts on that. And the other question that I see is, will this current situation impact in any major way on Australia's economic relationship with China? Will it be constrained in any way? That is to say, the current circumstances that comes from Dr. Anand Kumar of the Institute. Please go ahead.
Okay, yes, and look, your comments and questions about the inclusive nature of the Indo-Pacific is a really good one, and it's a difficult question. Obviously, I think the countries, like-minded countries, would like to see structures in the Indo-Pacific to be as inclusive as possible, and in the best of worlds, to include China, provided that China was willing to accept the rules of the road, and that would be the best outcome for everyone, I think. Unfortunately, they're not showing a lot of inclination for that, and so that then behoves all of us to establish various other arrangements among ourselves. We shouldn't, I don't think, put too much emphasis on the Quad. The Quad is an important dialogue, but there are a lot of other dialogues as well that are just as important, and I could name several trilateral arrangements that between India, Japan, United States, between US, Australia, Japan, Australia, India, Japan, and several others that really actually have a lot more substance than the Quad. And yes, Quad gets a lot of billing, but let's not get sort of too carried away with the whole thing. They're underlying that are a web of arrangements, which often have a lot more important. On a similar theme, Malabar, look, it always puzzled me and amused me to talk with people who would tell me that Malabar with 3 countries is good, but Malabar with 4 is bad. I was quite bemused by that. Somehow China would say, fine, 3 is good, but we'll get sort of really upset if there's 4 countries involved, including Australia. I just can't. I thought that was quite a...
And especially because, quadrilateral maritime exercises, as in military naval exercises, have been held between Australia, the United States, Japan, and the Philippines, and India, Japan, the United States, and Vietnam.
Yeah.
So you have various other versions of Malabar-like, however one-off they might be, but there are such events that take place.
Yeah, and so I never understood that argument. Frankly, I thought that those people who made the argument were almost giving China a veto over what arrangements we wanted to make among ourselves for our own reasons, and which I thought was an odd sort of approach to take. And look, to be honest, India's been the most cautious, I think, about the whole thing in recent years for its own reasons. I'd be happy to see that change, but again, let's not place too much emphasis on Malabar. It's like one exercise of many exercises, and many other exercises have much more substance, to be honest. Yes, it has some symbolic value, but much more symbolic value than substance in my view. And I've sort of argued for some time, if the sort of Malabar has too much baggage, then let's just change the name and call it something else. It really doesn't matter. So let's not get too upset either way about the whole thing. Australia's economic relationship with China, I covered that in a bit of detail. I should add that, obviously Australia, like I think basically every country in the world, is going to suffer quite significantly from the COVID crisis. We're not quite sure yet how much. I should add that Australia's mines are working day and night in loading stuff and sending it overseas, and our resource exports are almost at a record high, which is quite interesting, and that reflects the fact that many other suppliers of these resources have shut down their facilities in response to COVID, because COVID has had very little impact on Australia, we've managed to keep all of our export industries open, and they're making record amounts of export income for Australia. So again, that's a bit of a lucky break. But overall, I think there's, and look, this awareness, the awareness of being the dangers of being too reliant on selling stuff to China has been around for quite a long time, but obviously COVID accelerates that and makes it much more public, particularly when people are concerned about the availability of protective equipment and respirators and medical services, etc. So there will be, I think, after this crisis is over, there's going to be a very hard look in Australia and many other countries about how much we are willing to rely on China in terms of key manufacturers, that we should diversify that reliance and often, in many cases, bring it on shore.
Thank you. Dr. Shruti Pandalai from the Institute is asking, as tensions continue to rise in the South China Sea and Sino-American contestation intensifies, how will Australia respond to continued calls for military assistance? That is to say, calls from Washington for military assistance. I understand your point, she says, about FONOPs, but do we see any other areas of cooperation in the future? That is to say, in the military naval field, in that broad theater, leave aside FONOPs. The US essentially is asking Australia to do more, to participate, to be with them. I mean, it's not for a joyride that you sent the HMAS Parramatta to the South China Sea right now to join 4 other American naval ships that are warships that are already in the region. And the timing is obviously not a matter of sheer coincidence. It has come in the wake of the declaration by the Chinese of some new geographical terminologies for these islands, etc. From time to time, they, kind of reorganize their administrative districts there as a means of emphasizing their territorial control over that vast oceanic space. So, what else will you be willing to do? Perhaps is there some implication here for the U.S. Rotation through Darwin? Will you do more there on that front? Will the Chinese take umbrage? I mean, perhaps all that. And after you finish, then I can see that Admiral Sinha wants to come in and make a brief comment. So first, over to you.
Okay, look, I think, again, Australia is almost continuously postured in the South China Sea. So I actually place relatively little emphasis on the deployment of Parramatta. There's almost always Australian warships in the South China Sea. There's almost always Australian aircraft operating over the South China Sea. So whether symbolically they sent a vessel to join a US task group is fine. It's not seen here as sort of a major point in any particular direction. Obviously, if there is a threat of conflict, Australia would stand with the United States in responding to that conflict. There's no doubt about that. There is a question, a difficulty, well, not a difficulty, an issue about where Australia's military resources should be focused, whether they should be focused on the Middle East or the South Pacific or the South China Sea. Australia can't do everything everywhere. And, again, it's a question of judgment, whether in conjunction with our US allies, where the best place is to allocate defence resources. And obviously, to allocate more resources to the South China Sea, then you might need to withdraw them from the Middle East or the Pacific or the other way around, etc. So, that's always a question. Certainly my view is that Australia should have less defence resources deployed. Our Navy's been almost continuously deployed in the Persian Gulf since 1990, the last 3 decades. I would argue for a continuation of that reduction of our defence resources postured there. move it closer to home, whether it be in the South Pacific or the South China Sea. Really, I think one of the most important developments, and this is not often remarked upon, is the increase in cooperation between Australia and Indonesia in the South China Sea in terms of responding to Chinese assertiveness and claims against Indonesian maritime territory. And certainly in the last couple of years, we've seen the Indonesians reaching out to Australia to work with them in crafting a response to China. And I think that's a very important development. Darwin, we're going to continue to see the further development of Australia-US joint facilities in the north of Australia, including in Darwin. And that includes both on land, air and sea. Unfortunately, I think in the immediate term, the deployment of US Marines in Darwin has been somewhat curtailed by the COVID crisis. And in fact, there's going to be a lesser deployment this year than in previous years, but that's just, I think, a bit of a glitch. And in the longer run, we're only going to see even greater cooperation with the United States using Northern Australia as a lily pad for projection of forces into the Southeast Asia. I should add that's a big change from the alliance relationship. Through virtually all of the Cold War, there was almost no substantive US military presence in Australia. There was definitely an intelligence presence, but very, very few troops on the ground or other US facilities. That's a major change for Australia in the face of Chinese assertiveness to decide to
Let me button here by suggesting that was partly because the Soviet Union was not so focused on Australia and the theater around Australia. In this case, the player, China, is far more focused on Australia, and Australia is the thin end of the wedge, really. If Australia gives in, many of the alliances in the region also come crashing down like ninepin. So
I think there's a lot of truth in that, sir. But I think that's not the only. I mean, in Australia, there was a huge amount of resistance to. So, for example, there were a lot of proposals during the Cold War for US Air Force to base B-52s or other aircraft in Australia.
More of ISR. That would have been more of ISR. Here, no.
Well, it's for strike as well. Yeah. Okay. It was a lot of it was ISR, but it was also strike.
Okay.
And that provoked a lot of resistance from the Australian public. My sense is that resistance is largely faded away, and so for example, there's very little domestic resistance to the rotation of US Marines in Darwin, and we're going to be seeing a much further step up in that, which I don't think we'll see a lot of Australian domestic resistance to that. So over the long term, we're only going to see that growing and expanding, and also including other allies. So Singapore will continue to base much of its military in Australia, we'll see a growing presence of other countries in a lot of these facilities as well, which I think can only be welcomed. In terms of the Australian military presence in the South China Sea area, it's only going to grow. It's not just in cooperation with the United States, but also importantly in cooperation with key regional partners, whether it be under the Five-Power Defence Arrangement with Singapore and Malaysia, or bilaterally with Indonesia.
Thank you. Admiral Sinha, you have a comment to make? Piyush, please unmute.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you, David. I think you have said it all. I just wanted to make 2 points. The first point is I'm glad you mentioned about the resources, and we can do only so much, because if you see the entire Indo-Pacific, it clearly emerges that the regional powers with whom US is, increasing its cooperation are, divided into 3 very distinct sections. Indian Ocean region and the the South China Sea and East Sea and the Pacific. And I think the Australian Navy is doing well to take care of the Pacific and partly of the South China Sea with the allies. And with the present resources of the Australian Navy, I would suspect that it may not be possible to fan out too much because there has to be crew change, there has to be maintenance, etc., etc. In one of my conversations with the chief of the Australian Navy in 2013, when he came to Bombay, and he mentioned that this was one of the reasons that even Australia was a little reluctant to get into the Malabar. So it is not only India that 3 is good and 4 is bad. That's really not the sense here. That is number one. Secondly, I would like to just tell you that Malabar, the extent and the content of the exercise is extremely operational. Is fairly deep. It is not just one of the exercises. Though of course there's a lot of publicity is given to it for obvious reasons and mostly by the United States of America. But it is a very serious exercise. Interoperability, you see the weapon systems and the platforms which are being used. And I suspect that as and when Australia joins Malabar, it's not going to be one-off, and you will find that more of these exercises taking place from the ports in Japan or maybe in Australia on a longer presence of the 4 countries' forces. And that itself is a sort of great demonstration that you can't break laws and get away. So that's the point I wanted to make.
Yes.
Doctor, one or two more, please. I hope you'll bear with us a few more minutes, and we'll close
absolutely.
in another 5 minutes. We intend to close by 12 noon. We, as in Indian Standard Time, we'll close. As you know, Dr. Uday Bhanu Singh has very kindly facilitated this webinar, so we cannot deny him the opportunity to ask a question. And I think his question pertains to Southeast Asia. He asks whether this pandemic has implications for Vietnam's term as ASEAN chair. I mean, ASEAN current chair is Vietnam. And also Vietnam's term as a non-permanent member in the UNSC. What is the level of debilitation that Vietnam will suffer in terms of its multilateral profile at the moment? And then there is one more scholar who wants to ask a question. She's not given her question, but I suppose the only other way is to ask her to switch on her mic and ask her question, which is Dr. Ruchita Berry. Please pose your question, and then I'll ask Dr. Brewster to. Piyush?
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Please
good
unmute.
morning.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. I basically wanted to know your view on role of Australia in IORA now. Australia has been very active in IORA in the past. Do you think it will continue to be as active in IORA in future?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Brewster, you have a few more questions.
Okay, yes. Look, and I think the point about allocation of defence resources is really a key one for Australia because we have a very capable but reasonably small navy in terms of number of combatant vessels, and our almost continuous posturing in Persian Gulf and Western Indian Ocean has really come at a significant cost to Australia over the last several decades, at least according to, depending on how you calculate it, for much of that period, up to 20 to 25% of our major surface fleet were either deployed there or taken up with those deployments, because obviously there's very long transit times as well. And as that, I think those deployments saw a lot of mission creep, starting with, obviously it started with the first Gulf War, but all of the missions changed and ultimately ended up chasing drug smugglers. in the West Indian Ocean. I'm not saying that's a terrible thing, but it comes at a cost in terms of use of those resources, in terms of the training that could otherwise have been conducted. And I think we are going to see a continued step down of the Australian presence there, reallocation into Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And I think that's the correct decision that we're making on that. And, you know, a lot of that was driven, frankly, by whether it was mission creep or a sort of a perceived view in Australia that we needed to be seen in from alliance reasons to be flying the flag in Western Indian Ocean. I argued against that, and I would say that, you know, if you were to go to Washington and ask, well, would you prefer to see Australian Navy in the Persian Gulf or South China Sea? Where would you prefer the resources to be? And I think our American friends would prefer them to be in the South China Sea, frankly. But so it's always an issue of where you allocation of defence resources. I agree, and I certainly hope that Malabar will go from strength to strength, and whether it's the Malabar series or similar multilateral exercises under different names, I think that is only a good thing. We certainly need to step up our interoperability. As I think most of us here would know, Australia is highly interoperable with the United States, and to a little bit of a lesser extent with Japan. And certainly we need to take every single opportunity that we can to improve interoperability with our Indian friends. And to the extent that Malabar can be extended into more opportunities, not only including in the naval space, but also I would sort of put there has to be a greater emphasis on Air Force interactions than had previously been the case. Questions on Vietnam? To be honest, I really have to. I'm not a Southeast Asia expert, and I would defer to colleagues who know a lot more about that. Certainly, my take is that Vietnam has come out of the COVID, or going through the COVID crisis, reasonably well in terms of both the medical impact on Vietnam and the perception that I've seen is that Vietnam has been really on the front foot in terms of COVID diplomacy. They've been sending medical equipment to Europe, for example, and they seem to have really wanted to respond in a positive way. So I would hope that that would reflect well on their roles both in ASEAN and in the United Nations, but I would defer to Southeast Asian experts who no doubt know a lot more than I do in that area. In terms of IORA, it's an organisation which I've been had sort of fairly closely involved with for many years. Australia will continue to emphasise IORA, but I think there's also a realism about the limitations of that organisation. It's an organisation which is very loose and doesn't have a lot of capabilities. We need to be there, we need to continue to strengthen it, but we also need to work with other organisations. In my view, Australia should join, for example, the Indian Ocean Commission to increase its diplomatic engagement with the Southwest Indian Ocean states. And obviously, India joined as an observer a month or two ago. And I would strongly argue, well, I do strongly argue in Canberra that Australia should be taking a similar action in response to, I think China joined as an observer and Russia is seeking observer membership. And my experience with those island states is they would see Australia as a good friend to be involved with that organisation to help resist undue influence from China and others. So I would recommend not only an engagement with IORA, but also IOC and other Indian Ocean organisations as well.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, alas, it's time over, and I only want to echo the feelings of all the participants. That has been a most interesting and most informative and educative session with Dr. David Brewster. I take this opportunity, Dr. Brewster, not only to thank you for being so very generous with your time and the very expansive manner in which you have covered so many issues in depth today. It's been very, very interesting and informative for all of us. I also take this opportunity to wish you good health during the lockdown period. I do hope you can get out and run around the lake or climb up the Red Hill and get to see the wallabies. I don't think the wallabies care a fig for
No,
the COVID. They must be all around. Probably they've regained a lot more of the terrain than you would
they're
bargain.
probably taking over. Yeah.
That's right. Thank you very much again, and hope to see you soon virtually in the very near future. And once again, on behalf of
Thank you,
everyone,
sir.
I wish you
And
all a
thank-
wonderful afternoon. Yes,
Thank
you
you
again.
to and best wishes to all of Australia's friends in India as well.
Indeed. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.